Yesterday, we discussed Essay Docha Losas and the source for that from Kilayim B'tzitzis. The Smichus HaParsha was between the Isser Shatnez and the Mitzvah of Tzitzis. And we said that the Havamina would have been that the Mitzvah of Tzitzis could not override the lav of Kilayim, and therefore, if not for the Smichus, I would have assumed that the Mitzvah of Tzitzis does not apply to a beggar that you're not allowed to wear. And this fits in beautifully with what we discussed yesterday, great length, the name Rabbi Chanan, that the mitzvah of tzitzis is inherent in the beged, but not a beged that has kilayim in it. Kamash Malan, that's what the Smichas HaParsha always comes to shed a new light, a new chiddush, that the second pasuk is limiting the first pasuk, which means that the mitzvah of tzitzis is limiting the Isur Shatnez that would only apply in cases where there's no mitzvah tzitzis, but in a case where there's a mitzvah tzitzis, Isur Shatnez doesn't apply. And we spent a lot of time in the name of Rabbi Chanan yesterday to try to figure out how that could be synchronized with the general rule that Essay Dochalos is only a dechia and it's not a heter. Today we want to discuss another dimension of this principle of Essay Dochalos, and that is what's called bi'idna. And that means that the essay has to be simultaneous with the violation of the law. If, let's say, for example, you violate the law at time T1 and you only fulfilled the essay at time T2, then at the moment of T1, when you're violating the Lotz essay, you had no essay. I mean, it's very nice that we can anticipate the essay coming down the line, but right now there is no essay. So what's going to be doche the law at time T1 unless there's absolute simultaneity, which is called be'idna. And the big question is going to be how the requirement of be'idna will fit with kilayim b'tzitzis. What I mean is the following. The Torah tells me that I don't have to wear tzitzis. I only have to put on tzitzis when I have a beged with dalet kankas, but that's only the first condition. The second condition is when I'm wearing that beged. That means that in sequence of time, the chiyuv of tzitzis only emerges after I'm wearing the beged. So if we look at this in a very abstract conceptual way, when I put on the beged, at that moment I'm violating the law of kilayim because I have both semer and pishtim. The essay now emerges to be machayev me after I'm already lavush, I'm already in the state of lavish, I'm already wearing the beged. At that point, I've already violated the law. So let's see this inside. You're on the left column of page Chav, and it's going to be that new section there, which is about the third paragraph down from the top. Ein essay docha lotze ella be'idna. So that kilayim b'tzitzis is going to be very problematic if that is the paradigm, if that is the source for the principle of essay docha lotze, because we're going to have problems with setting up a be'idna in the case of kilayim b'tzitzis. Now, what is the basis? Where is the source in Shas that essay dochalosa only applies if it's be'idna? And that's the Gemara in Shabbos on Daf Kuf Lamed Beis. Amar Avash. Atzur lekoin lactose saras kidei lihitoyer v'lavod avoda. The Kohen, in order to perform his avoda, he has to be in a state of tahara. He cannot perform avodas hamigdash, the korbanos of the Beis Hamikdash, if he's in a state of tumah. Now he has tsaras, and what he wants to do is override the iser of what's called tzitas baheres, to cut off tsaras. In other words, the Torah requires that the process of purification goes step by step, where you go to the Kohen, and then after he does Hezger, and after a week, and another week, and finally the leprosy, we'll call it, heals. But in a sense, the Torah is saying that you're not allowed to completely sideswipe or circumvent the entire process of purification of Paras HaMitzor by simply cutting off the tzaras, surgically removing it. And l'chora, we would have said Says Rav Ashi that the essay of Avodas HaKorbanos should override the lotase of Tzitas Baheres. So let the Kohen cut off the Baheres in order to be Matayr himself for the sake of the mitzvah of the Avodah. And Rav Ashi says, no, that's not so. Why? Because at the moment that he cuts off the Baheres, he violates that law. The avoda and the kiyum of the essay is delayed until he later brings the carbon on the mizbeach. We cannot apply essay dochalosase in this circumstance because the lotzase will be violated before the essay. And yet, the Gemara assumes that with regard to your paradigm case of essay dochalosase, namely kilayim mitzitzis, we have be'idna. And another example of the requirement of Be'idna jumps out of the sugya in Beitza. The Gemara says that, let's say I want to violate the Isser of Chafira, or perhaps Tochen, in order to fulfill a mitzvah saseh of Kisi Adam, right? We're allowed to shecht an animal on Yontif. It's got to be a kosher chaya. There aren't too many of those, but let's say he takes a deer and he shechts it on Yontif, and an oaf is another possibility. Now he's chayiv in the mitzvah of kisui hadam, and for the sake of kisui hadam, he has to prepare the offer, and the offer, the ground, the dirt of kisui hadam has to be pulverized, so to speak. You need what's called katisha. You got to chop it up, grind it up, make it into like a powder. Now, making something like offer into a powder is a violation of Meleches Shabbos, and he wants to do it for the sake of Kisi Adam. The Gemara says we can't allow that. Why? Because the Kisi Adam, the Kiyum Mitzvah, is delayed until after he violates the lav at stage 1, at time T1, when he does the Tishas offer. So he violates the Malacha of Tochen before he fulfills the essay of Kisi Adam. And we don't have Be'idna. And now what we have to do is we have to figure out if our, as I call it, the paradigmic case of Essay Dochalosa, namely Kalayim B'tzitzis, really fits the bill of Be'idna. Does it have the requirement of Be'idna? I mean, it would be very paradoxical to say that we derive Essay Dochalosa from Kalayim B'tzitzis, and we require that it be Be'idna, but Kalayim B'tzitzis is not Be'idna. I mean, that's an untenable position. So here we're ready for Tosfos and the kasha of the Sagas Ari on Tosfos. And what we're learning now is quite famous in the what we call the Olama Yeshivot. Now, the Torah allows Kilayim B'tzitzis, and that we saw here on Daf Dalet. Later on, the Gemara on Daf Tzadi, here in Masechet Yevamot, says that if you have a sadin shel pishtan, you have a beged of pishtan, then the mitzvah saseh of the Torah is to put a chut of tcheles, and tcheles by definition is always wool, and attach it to this beged shel pishtan. But nevertheless, even though the Torah requires you to do so, the Chachamim made a gzeira, and they were afraid that maybe it's not really tcheles, because it's something that looks like tcheles, but it's a fraud. So they made a gzeira that you're not allowed to put tzitzis, meaning tcheles, onto a beged of pishtan. And the Gemara asks the obvious question. This is again a world famous sugya. How could the Rabbanan take a mitzvah d'oraisa and undermine the mitzvah? And the Gemara formulates the principle that applies here in this case of the Gzeira. Yesh koch b'yad chacham lakar dov min haTorah b'shevi altas. So the Torah is telling you not to put on the tzitzis, and that's called shevi altas. And it's like not taking a shofar and blowing it on Rosh Hashanah for Rosh Hashanah coincides with Shabbat. And we have many such cases. We'll have it in Lulav, where the Rabbanan will be oker dov min haTorah b'shevi altas. Tosfos says the following. Why is this called Shev V'altas? After all, he's putting the beged on. He's got a beged shel pishon, a linen garment. The very moment he actively puts it on, he is violating the mitzvah of tzitzis. So why do you call the Shev V'altas? I understand if you tell me not to blow the shofar or not to shake a lulav, that's called Shev V'altas, so remain passive. But if you're telling me put on the beged, and the beged has no tzitzis on it, you are actively violating the essay of tzitzis. So the moment he puts on the beged, adayin eno mechuyev b'tzitzis. He's only going to be obligated in tzitzis after he's wearing the beged, but not when he's putting on the beged. Right? There are two concepts here that are very similar, but worlds apart. They seem similar on the outside. One is the Maisel Levisha, and the other is the state of Lavush, which is the result of the Maisel Levisha. You can't have a Maisel Levisha without being Lavush, but they're two different situations with a sequence and a time difference between the two. First, he does a Maisel Levisha. At this point, he's not Chayiv in Tzitzis. He'll be Chayiv in Tzitzis when he's in a state of Lavush. Well, now we're telling him, the Rabbanon are telling him that because of Akzera, about Tcheles and so forth, we're going to tell you to remain passive and don't add the Tcheles to your beged. V'lachein, says Tosfos, Eino Neshav Maisa Levisha. There's no active bittul mitzvah, but rather it's a bittul b'chei v'altas. So when we tell him, remain passive, sit in your seat, and don't attach the tcheles to your beged. So to summarize, the underlying principle of the Gemara in Yevamot Daf Tzadi of Yesh Koch B'Yad Chacham and the Gzeira not to put on tzitzis in this beged shel mishpan is that there's no mitzvah of tzitzis in the levisha. The mitzvah of tzitzis is only after the levisha in the state of lavush, and therefore it's considered shevi alta. So that's going to lead us right into the territory, the hands of the Shagasari's kasha. Because if you're telling me that the moment of levisha, meaning the ma'aseh levisha, is not the moment of mitzvah tzitzis, well, now we have a discrepancy in time, a sequence in time between the Isser Kalayim, which is violated with the ma'aseh levisha, and the essay is only going to be chal afterwards when he adds tzitzis to his beged, or at least when he's lavush in tzitzis in his beged. Im kein ein ze be'idna. Says the Shagasari, Tosfos clearly is establishing that there's no be'idna in the case of tzitzis and kilayim, because since he's saying that tzitzis is not the ma'aseh levisha, but rather lavush, then there's a time sequence, says the Shagasari, between the ma'aseh levisha of kilayim and the violation thereof of Isakon, and the mitzvah of tzitzis, which is only going to be fulfilled later when he's in a state of lavush. I'm telling you, Rabbi, like this is, when you talk about lumdus, there's certain lumdus that's very, very limited in its popularity. This is like mainstream lumdus. If you had to teach a course on Talmudic methodology, you would probably start with the Shagasari. The difference between the Maisa and the subsequent state of being that comes later. And the Shagasari builds himself on a sugya on Daf Tzadi and Yevamot and the Tosfos. Says the Shagasari, we can only figure this out. We can only reconcile this according to what I call the revolutionary Shita Rabbeinu Tam. And we mentioned Rabbeinu Tam yesterday, and I think even the day before yesterday, that Rabbeinu Tam holds that it's a din in the Cheftzah beg that tzitzis, even if you bracket the Kiyum Mitzvah, for example, Balayla, or in the case of an Isha, we still will override the Isur Kilayim. So imagine, I have tzitzis on a beged of Pishtan. The tzitzis is tzemer, and I'm not being mekayim the mitzvah of tzitzis because I'm wearing it at night. The woman is wearing it daytime or nighttime. And minus the mitzvah of tzitzis, how do you apply esei dochalos aseh? And the only way out of that quandary is to assume that according to Rabbeinu Tam, the Torah says that if you have a beged of tzitzis, that status and that chiv tzitzis is in the beged. It's in the chefta of the beged, even before the gabra becomes obligated. And that chefta of beged shel tzitzis is matir that beged from the Isa Kilayim. If that be the case, then we have be'idna. We fulfill the requirement of simultaneity. He says, al pi shitas Rabbeinu Tam shehutru. We have to underline that word, right? Shehutru hakelayim b'tzitzis legamre, because otherwise Rabbeinu Tam makes no sense. There's no esek dochalos in a sense of dechia. You have to apply the principle of hutra. The afilu shalom b'makom mitzvah is kol shkein. Hutru shalom be'idna. Meaning the whole requirement of be'idna only applies when you're operating within the framework of dechia. And dechia means that in order to be dochel lotasa, you have to have, at the moment of the violation of the lotasa, a kir mitzvah saseh. Rabbeinu Tam is not operating in tzitzis, kalai tzitzis with those premises, because he's talking where there's no mitzvah saseh. So he must be telling us something about the heter of kalayim, that there's no kalayim in a beged shel tzitzis. If according to Rabbeinu Tam, the power of the mitzvah of tzitzis is such that it sets up a beged shel tzitzis as being mufka, as being excluded from kalayim, then we would have to be matir even if we're shalom be'idna, because the whole concept of be'idna only fits, it's only logical when you have an essay being docha losas. But in kalayim b'tzitzis, we don't have an essay being docha lotas. So that again, this is another example of what we discussed yesterday, that you can derive a principle from case X in the Torah. In this case, you can derive the principle of esei dochalos aseh from kalayim b'tzitzis, even though technically you do not have esei dochalos aseh. It's so paradoxical. In other words, we're going to create a conceptual structure, but in the actual achlitz application of that structure, it's going to be totally different. For example, we said yesterday, according to Rabbi Elchanan, how do we reconcile? Tosfos says that the chiyah is different than mitzvah b'kaf, or the way the Ramban formulates it, that the chiyah is different than hutra. And we said in the name of the Minchas Chinuch that basically both the Ramban and Tosfos are saying the same thing with different formulations. Well, I don't get it. How can we postulate esei dochalos and derive it from a case that's mitzvah sabakah, where it's hutra? And Tosfos says in the name of Rabbeinu Tam that kalayim is hutra. And point number two, how can we derive that esei dochalos only applies when it's be'idna, when kalayim is hutra? It's not even esei dochalos. It's just a pella. So as we discussed yesterday, we have this abstract analysis of the power of an essay. That in the case of kalayim b'tzitzis, according to Rabbeinu Tam, the essay is so powerful that it changes the nature of the chefts of the beged in such that there will be no iser chal on that chefts shel beged. So we see that in weighing on a scale essay and los aseh, the power of essay supersedes that of lot aseh. That's what the Smichas HaParshas is telling. That you think that lo tilbish kalayim should apply in the case of tzitzis. No, the Torah says gedilim taselefa to tell you that in the case of a chefts shel beged shel tzitzis, there is no kalayim. Once we have that, and we see the power of the essay vis-a-vis the lot aseh, again, not in terms of dechia, but in terms of establishing a limitation in the lot aseh, the lot aseh shouldn't apply where the essay will apply. Again, we're not ready for the kiyum essay on the gabra, but in the chefts of the beged there's an essay. Then how much more so essay dochalos aseh? Essay dochalos aseh is less, it's one notch lower on the scale. It's lakula. right? So we have like a kolshkin over here. If you're telling me that the los aseh won't apply in the case of a mitzvah of a beged shel tzitzis, how much more so could an essay be dochel lotas? Says the Shagasari, but you need essay dochlosa be'idna. Although again, the concept of idna is inapplicable to kalai b'tzitzis because kalai b'tzitzis according to Rabbeinu Tam is utra or mitzvasa b'kach. So there is no lav of kilayim on a beged shel tzitzis, but nevertheless, we're going to derive from that the power of the essay. But now the power of the essay is to be docha. You want to be docha, you have to have an essay and a key of mitzvahs essay at the moment that you're being docha the lav. You can't just say, well, I'll be docha the lav because the ends justify the means, and later on I'm going to be able to use this offer katuach, katush for my kisi adam, or later on the Kohen is going to be able to go into the Beis HaMikdash, do the avoda because he chopped off his tzaras. No. We need dechia. And dechia requires that it be simultaneous. And therefore, let's say, leaving out Rabbeinu Tam's scenario, in the classic scenario of Esei Dochalos and Tzitzis and Kalayim, where I'm chayav in Tzitzis, I'm wearing it during the day, not at night, then I would need that to be a simultaneity. So the Shagasari says, wait a minute, what do you mean simultaneity? There's no simultaneity here. Because Tosfos already established, based on the Sukkah of Tzadi, that the mitzvahs aseh is only chal after you already love it. As the Shagasari, we don't have that limitation in the case of Kilan. We have it in the case of Tichas Afar for the sake of Kisi Adam. We have it in the case of Ktzitzas Baheres for the Koina Ovid. That's pure classic Esei Dochalos Aseh, and we're going to require Be'id. But not in the case of Kalayim B'tzitzis. Because Kalayim B'tzitzis, although it is the source for Esei Dochalos Aseh, but in and of itself, it operates with a different set of rules and regulations. It operates with a different modus vivendi. Namely, that the Torah is limiting the Los Aseh of Kalayim to a Beged She'ena Machayev B'tzitzis. But if it's a Beged She'machayev B'tzitzis, then there's no Lo Taseh Kalayim. I don't need Be'idna. Now, the Shagasari also authored another work on Moadim, which is called the Turiyim. And he writes that Kol Mitzvah Shebeshum Panim I Efshal Asosa B'li Lahaktiv La Maisa Mesuyah Nechshav Oso Maisa Kilu Migufa Maisa. All right, let's take a little breather here because this particular Turiyim has tremendous ramifications, again, in the whole world, the whole structure of halakha. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, we've touched on it in the past. The Mishnah says in Masechet Sukkah on Daf Chaf that for the sake of Kabbalah's Pnei Rabba B'Regel, he could eat outside the sukkah. Why? He's on the road. He's traveling through, let's say, the wilderness, through the forests, through the highways in order to get to his Rebbe. And are we going to obligate him to set up a sukkah so he can sleep in sukkah that night before he gets to the morning when he gets to his Rebbe? And the answer is no. He's not obligated in sukkah. Why not? The Gemara says, Osek b'mitzvah, what do you mean Osek b'mitzvah? The mitzvah is Kabbalah's Pnei Rabba. But the answer is that a mitzvah begins with that necessary precondition or preliminary action. If I don't implement action X in order to get to the mitzvah Y, then action X is considered his askus for mitzvah. I'm involved in the mitzvah. And we mentioned the case of shaking out the talus when he finds someone who's lost talus, because if he doesn't shake it out, it's going to get fashimel, and he won't be able to fulfill the mitzvah of Hashavas HaBeinu. Therefore, also the mitzvah, part of the mitzvah, hence to the Rav Yosef. Somebody knocks on the door, and I can tell him, I don't have to answer the door to give you tzedakah because I'm involved in the mitzvah. What do you mean you're involved in the mitzvah? Well, you're shaking out a talus. I shake out my talus very often. It doesn't mean I'm involved in a mitzvah. But the answer is I cannot fulfill Hashavas HaBeinu without that mitzvah. So we have a concept now, which I call expanding the definition of the Ma'aseh Mitzvah. The scope of the Ma'aseh Mitzvah now is broadened, we mushroom to include any action that is necessary for that mitzvah. That's the breakthrough of the Turiyim. And by the way, this works in the flip side for Isurim as well. For example, let's say a Kohen is not allowed to enter into a Beis HaKvaros. Well, the truth is that the Isur is really Shehiyah Beis HaKvaros. The Beis HaKvaros. In other words, if the Kohen finds himself in the Beis HaKvaros, he's got to get out of the Beis HaKvaros. But entering into the Beis HaKvaros is already considered the beginning of the Ma'aseh Avera. So let's take, for example, the case that we mentioned last week, where in order to get the bone marrow out of the Korban Pesach and be Mekayim the mitzvah achila, because it's royal achila, I have to break the etzem. So do I apply esei dochalosas? Well, the esei is only the achila, but the answer is in this case, the marrow is inaccessible to him unless he breaks the bone. So breaking the bone becomes part of the mitzvah. And in the case of Yibur, he's not Mekayim the mitzvah until Gemar Bia, but the Tchilas Bia is already part of this Askus mitzvah. You remember all this? I mean, says the Shagas Aryeh, Kol mitzvah, any mitzvah that fits the following profile. There's no way that you can fulfill that mitzvah. Maisa X. Neshav also Maisa X. The expanded definition of the Maisa mitzvah. Now, Rav Soloveitchik would say there's Maisa mitzvah and Kiyuv mitzvah. We don't define the Maisa mitzvah by the Kiyuv mitzvah. The Maisa mitzvah has its own life, its own definition. And if the Maisa mitzvah is an expanded Maisa mitzvah, even though the Kiyuv mitzvah will be down the line, that's considered part of the Maisa mitzvah. So, for example, if a ger jumps into a mikvah, a gerus, he makes a bracha. Now, the mitzvah is to be inside the water, but jumping into the water is a necessary precondition in order to get into the water. So he can make a bracha over lasiyasa before he jumps into the water. The Gemara Tosa says that he can't do that because based on the Gemara himself and Daf Zayin, he's a kati gavrilo chasi fine. But you get the idea. Oh. So now the Shagas Aryeh says, I have an answer to the problem of Be'idna and Kilayim mitzitzis one. Li'olam yi'efshal l'kayim mitzitzis l'lo itu. Unless you wear the beged, again, the wearing of the beged itself, putting it on, is not a mitzvah tzitzis. But there's no way that you can fulfill the mitzvah tzitzis and be atuf, be lavush, unless you first do the atifa, the ma'aseh levisha. Therefore, he says, the ituf is now upgraded to the status of a ma'aseh mitzvah, v'udoches Allah, and now it overrides the law of kilayim. Al afshe b'shasa ituf adayin enim iskal yevis ha-mitzvah, meaning there's the ma'aseh mitzvah and the kiyum mitzvah. It's unbelievable because the Shagas Aryeh was before Reb Chaim, but he had Reb Chaim's derech. I mean, this is something that's so typical of Reb Chaim that all you need in order to generate be'idna and fulfill that condition is the ma'aseh mitzvah has to be be'idna, not the kiyum mitzvah. So the kiyum mitzvah will come later, but the ma'aseh mitzvah is enough to be dochen the lav if the ma'aseh mitzvah is simultaneous with the averis Allah. So now we're saying the ma'aseh mitzvah is the ma'aseh levisha, just like the Isur Kilayim is violated with the ma'aseh levisha of Kilayim. The afshe called din esei dochalosa say eno el v'moksh yefshel kaim say esei below averis Allah. So that the precondition for esei dochalosa is that you have no other way of achieving the essay unless you violate the law. If you have other options, then you have to take advantage of those other options. Ubecholzos eno doche ela be'idna. In other words, the Shagas Aryeh is reflecting, he's asking a kasha on himself. Why do you require be'idna? The whole the whole issue of Be'idna seems irrelevant because the only way you can get to the Kiyum HaMitzvah is by violating the law. Otherwise, there's no essay del Velosa. So that by definition fulfills the requirement of Be'idna. Do we catch that? I mean, this is a very profound piece of logic. Let me try to explain it for myself. I mean, you may have chopped it on the first round. For me, I need a second. We have two principles here that seem to be mutually exclusive. You can't have both. You can't tell me, A, that I only apply essay dochalosa if it's impossible to fulfill the essay without violating the law. And say, B, that I require be'idna. Because once you've set up your first definition, your first requirement and limitation, then by definition, you always have be'idna. You can never have eino be'idna. Why? Because what are you going to tell me it's eino be'idna, right? I haven't yet gotten to the essay. What do you mean I haven't gotten to the essay? We're talking about a scenario where it's impossible to get to the essay without first violating the law. So the violation of the law itself is part of the mitzvah. Why? Because our definition of the mitzvah is the broader definition that whatever I have to do in order to fulfill the mitzvah is part of the mitzvah. We're expanding the Masechet mitzvah. And you're telling me I can't apply essay dochalosas unless it's a situation where the only possibility of fulfilling the mitzvah is through the violation of the law, then the violation of the law is part of the essay. It's part of my expanded definition of the Masechet mitzvah. Then I have be'idna. What are you telling me? You're excluding shalom be'idna. I'll give you an example. We have two examples. It's beautiful. Tishas offer. The only way I can fulfill the mitzvah of Kisi Adam is by first grinding down my offer. If it's stones, I can't be Mekayim. So I might tell you, okay, you know what? Go across the road or take a long walk to your neighbor somewhere in the other end of town, and he has offer tafuach, what's it called? Efer tachuach. He has efer tachuach. He prepared it before Yom. So I say dochalosas. Essay dochalosa means that I have no access to any possibility of fulfilling the mitzvah without violating the law. So that would mean that the ketisha of the offer, by definition now, according to the Shakasari, must be classified as part of the Masechet mitzvah. No, what do you mean Masechet mitzvah? Ketisha's offer is a Masechet mitzvah. Masechet mitzvah is Kisi Adam. But if I cannot achieve the end result of Kisi Adam without first doing a Ketisha, then the Ketisha by definition becomes part of my Masechet mitzvah. So it's always going to be Be'idna. And the Gemara establishes that it's low Be'idna. There's no essay dochalos in the case of Ketisha's offer. Now let's take our other case. The Kohen is Tameh because he has a Neged Tzaras. He cannot do the Avodah. And if the only way he can be machshir himself to do the avodah is by being Matar himself by cutting off the baheres, then the cutting off the baheres is the beginning of the mitzvah of the avodah. And what's my paradigmic case from which I derive this is the case of Levishas tzitzis, Beged shel tzitzis. Now, the Levish itself, Tosfos says, is not the mitzvah of tzitzis. The mitzvah of tzitzis only applies after I'm loved. So how do I apply Essay Dochalosis? And the answer is, according to this Shagasari in heaven, because I cannot fulfill the mitzvah of tzitzis without first putting on the Beged. So the Levisha becomes part of the expanded definition of the Masechet mitzvah. Therefore, it's be'idna. The moment that I do the Levisha, I violate Kalayim, I'm also doing a Masechet mitzvah of Levisha tzitzis. Well, if that be the case, then by definition, in all cases of Essay Dochalosis, it should always be considered. So here I would suggest the following. Again, he's going to give his answer, but I enjoy trying to come up with my own answer. And hopefully he'll say the same thing in a different way. When do we expand the Masechet mitzvah? We expand the Masechet mitzvah when it's impossible By definition. Let me explain. I'm adding those two words by definition. I can do Kisiyat now without teaching. All I have to do is knock on your door and borrow some Afer Tachua. In this particular circumstance, I have no option. There's no one in the state of Illinois that has Efer Tachua. But I can't define an expanded Maisa mitzvah based on the reality that's in front of me, just because I don't have access to Ketisha. Or the Ketisha becomes part of the Maisa mitzvah. No. It makes it impossible for me to fulfill the mitzvah of Kisiyah now without doing the Ketisha. But I can't allow myself that luxury of redefining and expanding the definition of the Maisa mitzvah simply because I don't have access to Efer Tachua. Same thing in the case of the Kohen. It's true that if the Kohen wants to do the Avodah now, in order to prepare himself as a suitable candidate for the Avodah, he's got to get rid of the Tzaras, but that doesn't mean cutting off the Tzaras becomes part of the Maisa mitzvah of the Avodah. I'll give you a simple joke as a proof to this. Does he have to wear his Bigdei Kahuna when he cuts off the Bayeres? Nobody would say such a thing. But if it's part of the Avodah, then the Avodah without Bigdei Kahuna is psula. I can probably give you 500 after you. It happens to be that this Kohen in this situation finds himself in an impossible no way out. Mission impossible. He can't do the Avodah without cutting off the Bayeres. But that doesn't allow you to expand the definition of the mitzvah of Avodah to include the Ketzisas Bayeres. Shankin and Tzitzis. There's no way under the sun that you could be lavish with Tzitzis without Levisha. I mean, you could say, well, maybe it would float down from Shamayim, but that's already Maisa Nisa. But Al Piderech HaTeva, lavish is the flip side of a Maisa Levisha. So to take that one step beyond and say I expand the definition of my mitzvah and my Maisa mitzvah to include the Maisa Levisha, that's a skip and a hop. I mean, that's not there's no long distance here. Is there any way of getting to the marrow without breaking the bone? Absolutely not. Not Al Piderech HaTeva. I mean, you can talk about, now they have laser surgery and you can suck it out and blah, blah, blah. But to tell me that I start my achila by getting access, again, I'm not convinced, but maybe you could say such. Let's see what the Shagasai has to say. Okay. Ein Zeh Ella, you have it, it's like 5 lines up before the end of the page. Kishe the mikra, efshel l'kayim shneim, going to Kisei Adam. Oh, beautiful, the mikra. So under these particular circumstances, since I have no access to the offer that I need for Kisu, then it becomes the efshel. And that's a precondition for the chiyuv esed of velosis. And Yeshua offer muchan, what I call the efer takua, is hareu yachal lechasis mibli lavar isu ketishas biyomta. So he happens to be in a situation where he doesn't have access to offer muchan. He has no choice but to do the ketisha in order to facilitate, in order to set up the possibility of kis. Okay, you'll tell me I cheated. I did not cheat. One second. He at the very end, the finish line, he took a turn here. One second. He's got a beged shel pishtan. Now he has to put on tcheles, which is made of tzemer. And I don't think that's what he means. No, he has a beged of Pishtan, and the only way that he could possibly fulfill the mitzvah of tzitzis is by putting on kilayim, by adding tcheles, which is tzemer. But again, we're trying to set it up that the Maisel Avish is part of the mitzvah. Right? Let's go back to the third line in this paragraph. I guess there's a line missing here. I think he's saying that both conditions are fulfilled. Number one, it's the efshel akaimus esei mibli lavas halav, because if he has a beged shel pishton, how can he fulfill his mitzvah vis-a-vis this beged without putting on kilayim? And number two, the ituf itself is impossible. To say the kiyum of lavush is impossible without ituf. Okay. Now he has a tosus in Zvachim. This is on the top page Chaf Aleph. Amar Rav, Zvachim daf tzadi zayin. Ein esei dochalotis shebemikdash. So now we're talking about Korban Pesach, and he wants to get out the marrow, and he has to break the bones in order to extract the marrow. And Rav applies a principle, formulates the law of Ein esei dochalos shebemikdash, afal pi shebekach misbatel ha'esei shel achilas ha'pesach b'moach, in the marrow shebe'etzem. I just want to, in my own mind, just turn this around in my mind. How could it be that the principle of esei docha losas does not apply in Migdash? I mean, again, that's not part of our discussion today, but just that saying that esei docha losas is the chia, and we don't want to be docha lavim in the Migdash. I guess he's saying the following. I mean, I have to see the sugya inside. But in Migdash, we want to do everything on the up and up. You know what I mean? The how should I say, the smoothest way possible. So in general, in mitzvahs, umatum, wherever you do the mitzvah, okay, so you would dochalav, and that's okay. The Torah says esei dochalosas. But when you walk into the Migdash, you don't want to involve yourself in the mitzvah of Migdash by overriding a lot. That's wrong. But yeah, maybe it's probably a lot deeper than that. But now, is this a case of be'idna? If it's not, then the whole sugya makes no sense. I mean, Rav is telling you, do not apply esei dochalosas because of Migdash. Had it been outside the Migdash, you would definitely apply esei dochalosas. So we must be talking about a scenario which fulfills all the requirements of esei dochalosas, meaning be'idna. Picture b'tosus ma'rai zualo bizman averish shmir se'etzem adayin lo miskayim ha'mitzvos esei dachilas ha'pesach. So therefore, forget about Migdash. B'chol Torah, anytime that the Torah will apply esei dochalosas, we require be'idna. The inichu b'kush. And now the question is, can we apply the yardstick of the Tur Yevamot? The Piskat told some Kasushin, efshel kaimus esei b'li binyan acher, unless he's dochel alav, harei doches alav af shelo be'id, because of the Tur Yevamot shetiritzehu miguf divrei atosus el shenishmat me'asforim. All right, that's a technicality, but whatever we see in the Piskat Tosus, we're going to put it into Tosus himself. And this is going to be the source for our expanded definition of the mitzvah that we saw in the case of Levishas Tzitzis, putting on the beged, And now we're going to apply it to breaking the bone. And we're going to say that that's the expanded definition of the mitzvah. And we can apply Ese Dokalos Ese. It's all fine and dandy. We have it. It's interesting that Tos himself did not give that answer. I suspect that Tos was held it's true. I mean, I can't get the marrow out without breaking the bone. That, yeah, but let's keep in mind that the essay can be fulfilled with achilas kizayis. Right? We set up a chabura and we calculate, given the size of the lamb, that we can guarantee that every member of that chabura will be presented with an opportunity to kizayis of the lamb. So each person in the chabura eats a kizayis of the lamb, or the goat, the kid, as we call it, right? And he fulfills this mitzvah of achilas ha-pesach. Now there's another mitzvah to make sure that the entire Pesach is eaten. So the claim here is that it's impossible for everything that's edible to be eaten without breaking the bones. You've got edible marrow inside the bone. That's why in my family we're very makbid to eat the marrow. We break the bone and eat the marrow, because the only reason you're not allowed to eat the marrow is only because you have an Eitzer of Shviras Etzem. But since we're not eating Kodshim Bachutz, and there's no Shviras Etzem, so we break the bone in order to eat the marrow. I'm just joking with you. I don't know, you look at me like I'm serious. But no, it's true that back in Poland, that's my father told me they were very much to eat the bone marrow. In Poland, they used to fight over the bones because, you break the bone and eat the marrow. So the basic mitzvah, I'll call it the Chovas Gavra of Korban Pesach, we can fulfill without breaking the marrow, by breaking the bone. So is that cool? He's saying that it's the Efshel L'Kaimus essay being an Achet. Not sure how that works. Oh, by the way, I see that in the footnote, he quotes both the Noda Yehuda and Hagos Baruch Tam, who both assume that in the case of Shviras Etzem, it's not called Be'idna. Because when he breaks the bone, he's not Makayim the Esed. That's how he interprets Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi says that Esed Dochalos in Migdash, but yet we will not break the bone. We'll not permit you to break the bone and violate the law because it's not Be'idna. You'll only be Makayim the Esed later when you eat the marrow. So he's not. If we interpret Rav Ashi in that light, then Rav Ashi is not willing to accept this expanded definition of the essay to the tune of, well, since you can't get to the marrow without breaking the bone, after the breaking of the bone, it's part of the mitzvah's essay. And it's been, Rav Ashi never bought into this. All right, but we still have Rava. We want to contend with Rava, and Rava holds that in this case we would apply Esed Dochalos, not for the fact that it was in the Migdash. It's not Be'idna. The answer is that I cannot fulfill the mitzvah of Achila vis-a-vis that marrow without breaking the bone. It's an impossibility. If she so zealous, Messiashi v'divei atosus chagiga beis on beis shehikshu madua also lechatzi ever v'chatzi ben chor lisa bas chorim. He's saying that the chatzi ever is enjoined from having a relationship with the bas chorim is Yovo Essay the period of review, Biyidche Es Hala. Why don't we apply Essay Dochalosase and say that the Chatzi Ben Chorin Shabo has a mitzvah period of review, and that's going to override the lav vis-a-vis the Chatzi Evet Shabo, and that's going to permit him to marry Bas Chorin. And instead, the Gemara says we have to beat up his Adon until he's blue in the face, and he agrees to give him a get shichur. The partner that's still maintaining ownership. Why not just apply the principle of Esei Dochalos Esei? Yeah, so this gets back to our discussion by Yibum, that we said that the mitzvah of Yibum is only fulfilled with Sof Bia, and we'll assume the same thing as far as period of Rivia is concerned. So the violation of Kedesha, if an Eved, a Chatzi Eved in this case, has a relationship with a Bas Chorin, is already violated at the Tchilas Bia. So according to the Shagasarya, we should apply Esei Dochalos in this case. Because it's impossible to get to Gemar Bia without Tchilas Bia. So Tchilas Bia should be my expanded definition of the Esei. Mitirtzu Shesei the period of Kaim Rak B'Sof Bia. Alav Nekar Kvar B'Tchilas Bia. So there's no Be'idna. That's why we have to force the Adon to deliver get Shichur to his Eved. Eved. So the Omer ain't Mokum L'Terutzam Sharei Efshel is Sof Bia below Tchilas Bia. Now again, Tosus didn't give that explanation for Rava. If Rava and Zvachim of Eina Esei Dochlos Sech of Mikdash, according to Tosus, was not understandable, was not fathomable, because he's got to break the etzem. I'm sorry, because when he breaks the etzem, he hasn't yet been mekayim the mitzvah achila. You see that Tosus consistently there, and also the Tosus Chagiga regarding Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chorin, he's not operating with the expanded definition of the Ma'aseh Mitzvah, but Esei Dochalosa Be'idna applies to the actual Ma'aseh Mitzvah, not to the expanded Ma'aseh Mitzvah, not to anything that's necessary in order to get to this, like breaking the etzem, or Tchilas Bia for Sof Bia. So what's the issue here? Yeah, we're assuming that there's no Sof Bia without Tchilas Bia, and we're assuming that there's no Achilas HaMoach without Shviras Etzem. Yeah, so apparently Tosas Shita is that it's the Kiyum HaMitzvah that's Docha the Losaseh, not the Ma'aseh Mitzvah. And you need Be'idna at the moment of the Kiyum HaMitzvah. I'm not sure if that's a tenable position, but let's throw it out there. So it's very nice that you have to break the bone in order to get access to the marrow, but that's not the Kiyum HaMitzvah. Kiyum HaMitzvah is when he eats it. It's very nice that you need a Tchilas Bia in order to arrive at the Sof Bia, but that's not the Kiyum HaMitzvah. If he would terminate his Bia midway, he would not have the mitzvah. He needs to finish the mitzvah with the Gemar Bia. So the Kiyum HaMitzvah is only obtained with the Gemar Bia. And Esei Dochalosa Be'idna has to be B'Shas Kiyum HaMitzvah. The Kiyum HaMitzvah that overrides the Lotus. So at this point, we really are a little bit in hot water here because in the case of Kalayim B'tzitzis, we said that we have this expanded definition of the Ma'aser Mitzvah, and therefore there is Be'id. Now that was the sheet of the Turi Even. And the Turi Even would therefore logically apply that to the case of Shviras Etzem. Hence, Rav has to formulate his principle of Eina Esei Dov Lo Taseshem B'Mikdash. And we still have an unanswered question in Chatzi Eben Chatzi Ben Chorin, because there, why do we have to force the Adon to deliver a get? Why not apply the principle of Esei Docha Losas? And the key of a mitzvah period review is much later, but the Ma'aser mitzvah is the Ma'aser Beer. Or alternatively, it's the Gemara Beer, which is the key of a mitzvah, but you can't get to Gemara Beer without Chilas Beer.
And the Chatziel is not because she's not.
In other words, if you say that she's not obligated period of review, so we don't have the essay dochlosa by her, unless right,
this for him,
right, unless we apply the Tosis Yom Kippurim with the Chiddush, the revolution, that once there's essay dochlosa on one partner, we transfer it over to the other partner, even though that partner is not chayiv in the essay. But if you don't accept the Tosis Yom Kippurim, then we could answer that the Gemara there is beating up the Adon because she cannot comply with his mitzvah period meridian so far she doesn't have the mitzvah period. That's good. Okay. Now he has the Baruch Tam. I forgot who the Baruch Tam is. I mean, he's not contemporary, maybe 150 years ago. He writes the following. The Gemara later on at Daf Vav Hamid Beis is going to discuss the key of mitzvah of Sreifa in the case of a mechuyev misa, right? One of the four misas bezdin is Sreifa, so they have to heat up the molten lead. And the question is, can we do this on Shabbos? So Bas Kohen Shezinsa is obligated in Sreifa. Can we violate the Isar of Havara b'Shabbos for the sake of the mitzvah of Misas Bezdin? Says the Ritva in the name of Rabbeinu Tam, she'efshar she'izkayma esei b'zman asiyas hamalacha b'Shabbos. How do you set up a be'idna? Igon she'yitkechu SP anidon v'yitno b'piv sinor she'yesh bo psila v'yaviru eish v'tikonas oferes aniteches l'tov piv. So the Riva is doing somersaults in the air to set up the id. You know, you heat it up when it's already in her mouth. So simultaneity. Pain customer ban. Rashba cholek. We saw this alluded to it in notes. Kasav. She efsha shalotia havara v'abishul kodemes l'zman misa. You're going to have to start burning it before she dies, and the kiyum misses when she dies. So the Rashba therefore insists that it's not be'idna against the Ritva. Interesting because the Rashba is before the Ritva. The Ein Zed Dome L'Kelayim B'Tzitzis. What does he mean? Ein zed domel l'kelayim b'tzitzis. In the case of kelayim b'tzitzis, there is be'id. So I don't know, is the Rashba operating with the Shagas Aryeh? Or maybe he's operating with Rabbeinu Tam that we don't even need a Esei Tochalos and Kelayim B'tzitzis because it's Hutra. Also Baruch Tam, so das Rabbeinu Tam v'Ramban kol shenasa ma'isa isra mitzvah b'ma'isa echad lelo hefsek nechshav ador be'idna. So what does this mean? According to the Baruch Tam, Rabbeinu Tam and the Ramban, in other words, he lights the fire that heats up the metal, which is inside her mouth, and that's going to eventually bring to her death. So the act of bishul or havara will overlap with the mitzvah of her death. And there's no hefsek. You understand what I mean? He sets up a scenario which automatically brings to her death. So that's called Maisa Echad. And that's called Be'idna. Even though the Havara is going to take place before the Kiyum Mitzvah, before she dies, but it doesn't matter because once he does that Havara, everything happens automatically. It's like Isha Mishum Chitza. You shoot out the arrow, and it could be a few seconds later, but the arrow will hit its target. So that's called Maisa Echad below Hefs. And that sheet in Rishonim holds that that's enough to fulfill the condition of what? Of Be'id. L'fizeh, af kilayim b'tzitzis, that shavan ki be'idno, ki be also Maisa Levisha, Umakayim mitzvah tzitzis, be over al kilayim. Once he puts on the beged, everything happens automatically. He'll have a kiyuma mitzvah of levisha tzitzis. He'll have an iser of levisha kilayim. That's called be'idn. Kevan shuba also maisa. And I would add the words b'li hefsek. Umakayim mitzvah tzitzis be over al kilayim. Afal pishenim miskayemes b'vasachas. Right, the kiyuma mitzvah tzitzis is later on. It's all part of one mice. And he has a Gemara Beitza Efshel Liktoch Ofar Fasos Dam Bivas Achas. El She'ena Kisi Dochi Yot Michuchi Yotim Los Hasevieseg Vare Af Im Kochim Al Gabi Adam. So he does the Ketisha on top of the dam in such a way that as he grinds the afar, it falls onto the dam. Even though there'll be a minimal time difference between the actual Ketisha until it actually falls onto the dam, there's a fraction of a second of a difference. Why? Because Hakolu Maisa Echad below Hefs. So we have a number of definitions of be'idn. Some people require, it seems like that's cheap, that tells us that be'idn requires that the kiyuma mitzvah be be'idn. Then we have the Shagasari who has this expanded definition of the Maisa mitzvah. And now we have a new shita of the Baruch Tam in defining be'idn when it's one long Maisa, even if it's not actually simultaneous, but that Maisa will overlap with both an essay and a losas, so without any hefsek in between. Okay, then, so that's where we're going to stop for today. Very, very nice. Thank you very much.